to you on Saturday, 2 days from now. Okay. And then, yeah, I think, yeah, it says right here through the 21st. Okay. All right. So I'll remind you of all that, you know, when we get through stuff here, maybe in an hour or so. So here, I want to start talking about this guy here. Can you give me a nod that you see this PowerPoint? Okay, you do see it. Okay. Anyway, so it was, I think, last week that you did an assignment in which you did actually talk about this guy. There were words like mechanical solidarity, organic solidarity, division of labor, and so on. So he's one of the 3 founding fathers of sociology. His ideas have laid the groundwork for one of the fundamental theoretical paradigms, the order or structural functional paradigm. So I'm going to talk about his ideas. I'm going to run through them in a lot less detail than what you see up here. So here's a picture of the guy. Okay, he was a French guy. He was actually a French Jewish person, which is important if you get into a certain amount of detail about how he came about, how he came to his ideas. We're going to kind of skip all that, okay, and just run to the meat of the matter. But so there's, the next slide shows, yeah, so he lived in France. He lived up in the northeast in this area called Alsace-Lorraine. He eventually found his way to the center of France, Paris, got a real good education, became a philosopher, and then he was mostly interested in questions of social order. How does society work? And he ended up founding the first, I believe it was the first department of sociology in Europe. This slide here reminds us of what is a structural functional approach. And what it is, it's defined by a question. And the question is, what holds society together? Okay? How does a society made up of all kinds of different parts, different kinds of persons, different occupations, different beliefs, you name it, all kinds of different stuff, how does it all hold together so that it functions as a single unit over time? That's his big question. Okay? You could say that for a tiny society, a hunter-gatherer society of just a few dozen people, you could say that's an easier kind of question to answer. Okay? Maybe. But definitely for a really big society with millions and millions of people, huge geographical expanse, consider the United States of today, or any other nation state for that matter, it's a much tougher question. And Durkheim provides answers to that question. But the first thing he does is, in trying to answer those questions, he looks to what people have said in the past. And we're going to talk about one kind of theory that he himself dealt with. Okay? Because I think it's important for people to be acquainted with these theories because they play such a major role in our own intellectual tradition. So I'm going to tell you about this set of theories often called contract theory. And as I'm waiting to come to the next slide, 2 different people, okay, came up with contract, and we know about who these people were. They're the most famous people in what's called the contract. Contract theory is a theory of how society came into existence for the very first time. It's a theory about how society holds together. What's the glue that holds society together? Okay. So this guy named Thomas Hobbes, and then another fellow named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thomas Hobbes was from like the 1600s, Rousseau from the 1700s. Hobbes was an Englishman, an English person. So in what we call today, right, the United Kingdom, it wasn't called that at the time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, much later, and he was a person who had grown up in Switzerland. Now, here's the story. Thomas Hobbes, and by the way, when Thomas Hobbes was writing, there was lots of civil war over religion, over the role of the king in parliament. People were at each other's throats at the time. So there was a multi-decade civil war. A king actually lost his head. He had his head cut off, okay, by kind of the rebellious segments of British society at the time. So the background was one of lots of strife, civil war, and so on. And Thomas Hobbes, the question of what actually makes society an orderly, relatively peaceful, harmonious place was much on his mind. Okay, here's his story. I'm going to tell it as quickly as I can and then see what you guys think about it when I compare it to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Here's the story he tells, guys. You with me? Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, before there was any government, before there were any laws, no government, no laws, people weren't even literate. They were just living in forests, running around, trying to make a living for themselves, hunting rabbits and deer and who knows what, gathering stuff, right? They're like hunter and gatherers. No laws, no government. And here's what Hobbes said. Hobbes began his story with an assumption about what human beings were like deep down. Call it a premise of human nature. He began with the premise of human nature, according to which human beings were naturally nasty, in the sense that they were very selfish. They were self-oriented. They only cared about their own individual goals. That is mostly surviving. So they were self-preservation machines. And if other people got in their way, if other people wanted the rabbit that they were trying to hunt, well, they would take whatever measures they could, that they were able to, in order to assure that they would get ahead and get the rabbit. I don't know, maybe they might pick up a rock and throw it at the other person that they think is going to go after that rabbit. Or maybe once the other person gets the rabbit, they think to themselves, I know what I can do. And they trip that person up and they knock them over the head and they grab their rabbit and then they tie and bind the other person and say, you're not going to work for me from now on, right? So you might harm, maim, murder, or enslave other people as long as it got you ahead in this game of self-preservation. Okay, so Hobbes says we're basically these selfish self-preservation machines. And he said, if everyone's like that, just imagine what life would be like. It would be nasty. He said he called this a state of nature before all governments. In a state of nature, human life was nasty, brutish, and short, he said. And then he said this, intolerable. Life like that, if lived long enough, becomes intolerable to people. They can't put up with it anymore, okay? And so what they do in this intolerable situation is one fine day, as if by magic, they all look at each other and go and say, this stinks. How can we get out of this state of nature? It's what Hobbes called a war of all against all. Okay? And what he said is that people decided to agree to the following terms. You cannot kill each other. You cannot take each other's stuff. If somebody got a rabbit, then you can't take their rabbit. You can't enslave other people. You can't do all these things that we used to do in a state of nature, and we all agree on that. It's like a contract. It's a pact. It's an agreement. Okay? So that's the idea. There's this founding moment when everybody shakes hands with one another, as it were, and agrees that they should abide by these laws, and life will become better, become less insecure, become less bloody, become longer, essentially. Okay, then Hobbes says one more thing. He says, now here's the problem, is because human beings are the way that I said they were, that is, they're essentially selfish. If they have a way of getting around these rules, of breaking the agreement they'll do that, right? If they think that you are naively obeying, abiding by the rules, they'll say, oh, I got a sucker on my hands. I got somebody who's naive. I'm going to take advantage of them. They're going to abide by the laws, and while they're doing that, I'm going to break it, right? So Hobbes says human beings can't trust each other because the way they are deep down. Therefore, he said, what we require, and by the way, the book that he wrote in which he states all this stuff was called The Leviathan. The Leviathan is a monster that's found in the Christian Bible. I think it's like I don't know if it's in the Revelations of St. John or what have you, but in any event, the Leviathan represented a single powerful person that everyone agreed would be the person who stood above everybody else and held the arms, the weapons, the standing army and the cannons and the muskets and everything else to enforce the law. You couldn't trust people to abide by the law, so what you did is you chose this neutral third party, okay, who would enforce the law. Okay? So you can only trust people if there was the threat of violent enforcement or punishment behind it. Okay? So what's interesting about that is, if you think about it, that theory actually counsels a certain kind of government, right? A certain form of self-government. Okay, let me contrast that really quickly with the next guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau pretty much told the same story as Hobbes, except he said, before governments and laws and all that stuff, when we were living in the forest in a state of nature, humans actually, they were more nice than they were nasty. Human beings, he said, were gifted with what he called compassion. What he meant by compassion mostly is that when we observe other people in pain, it gives us pain. When we see, I don't know, some like a little kid, you see that they got their hand on the sidewalk outside and somebody accidentally steps on their fingers. You wince. It hurts to see that person hurt, right? I mean, there's something triggered in your own brain that makes their pain almost like your pain. Therefore, said Rousseau, we actually go out of our way to reduce other people's pain because that reduces our own pain, right? So we empathize with other people. We feel what they feel. And that actually makes us nicer, okay, than Hobbes would have suggested we are. Okay. However, Rousseau said that in that state of nature, things actually did go south, did go bad. It became a war of all against all because some people became greedy. Some people said, this rabbit warren or this apple orchard or this nice place here is mine. Mine, 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 mine. I'm going to make a fence around it and other people can't get to it unless they ask me permission and so on. And what that led to was inequality and envy and a whole host of, civil strife, disagreements between people. So then they started acting like Hobbes said that they acted, okay? Became a war of all against all. It became intolerable. And at some point, okay, people got together and did what Hobbes said. They agreed to limit their ability to harm, maim, steal, and so on. The difference was, and at this point, I think I'm going to unshare if it allows me to. Stop the share. At this point, Hobbes, or I'm sorry, Rousseau said, the end is different for Rousseau than it is for Hobbes, for the reason that Rousseau said, since we're nice, since we're not nasty deep down the way Hobbes said we were, we don't need this strong ruler with a club over our heads to make sure that we obey. Since we prefer not to inflict harm on each other, we can trust each other, right? So we don't need a big standing army, a big police force, a big this, that, or the other thing. And really, Hobbes actually recommended having something like an absolute monarchy so that all the enforcement power could be concentrated in the hands of that one person, okay? Whereas Rousseau recommended a kind of radical direct democracy, okay, where, I mean, it was very hard to acquire any real power over other people, okay, because you could be, if you were an elected official, you could be fired right away at will, okay? So you see different kinds of government recommendations coming from these different kinds of theories. Now, what I was curious to hear from people, I kind of wanted to stop there and ask Leanne and Dora and Dilma and Mo, okay, and everyone here, Jonathan and Jessica. Do you think Hobbes got it right? Or do you think Rousseau got it right? Who, to your mind, seems to have more accurately put their finger on human beings? Would you consider yourself a Hobbesian kind of person? War of all against all, right? We're kind of nasty. You can't really trust us. You need to enforce, big enforce stick, okay? Or, you know, do you think we're more like Rousseau said we're like? Anybody have any kind of strong feelings one way? Oh, Vilma wrote down, oh, let's see. Who is it that just, oh, Alexandra, is that, you said, I like to think Rousseau got it right. However, I think it's a balance of the two, or depends on the person. Yeah, that's, to be sure, that's absolutely, that's got to be right? In a way, Hobbes and Rousseau's depictions of human beings seems a little single-dimensional, right? Like they're either nasty or they're nice, whereas our experience, maybe even our knowledge of ourselves, tells us, well, it kind of depends on whether I've just eaten or not, right? You know, if I've just eaten and I feel contented, I'm super generous and nice and easygoing and so on. But yeah, yeah, I buy that. But I wonder if anybody thinks even allowing for more complexity, subtlety in their view, whether or not they think, you know, things are weighted in one way or another more. Vilma just wrote Hobbes. Jonathan, do you have any particular inclination? Would you be a Hobbesian or a Rousseauan? Jessica, how about yourself? Mo, you want to weigh in?
Well, basically my answer got said already, so it's basically just a mix of both, depends on the person.
Okay, yeah, you're all like, oh, and then Jonathan said, interesting. I'm trying to, here's what he said. He said, we have jumped from a Hobbes to a Rousseau. Jessica says, I agree, a mix. The time is low. I'm not sure what that means. I think I understand what Jonathan meant by we jumped from a Hobbes to a Rousseau. Oh, that's interesting. That maybe after we did make the compact, somehow our nature altered. That once we had these laws in place, that instituted some kind of change. Maybe we suddenly become socialized in a different way, so that if like it wasn't part of our nature to be nice and compassionate, put ourselves in other people's shoes, so that our pain, their pain is our pain. Once we institute these laws, and that leads to a different way of raising people, a different way of training them, that we train ourselves into being different sorts of creatures than we used to be. I don't know if I'm taking a long leap, and that was reading too much into what you said, but I mean, I could see a person going in that direction. Dora, do you have any thoughts? Or do you have any thoughts? Do you think you're Hobbesian or Rousseauian? I ask these questions because this is actually a long, eternal, and important debate within the social sciences, especially the political science. I think there have been different studies on certain animals being capable of empathy as well, which I think lends itself more towards a Rousseau philosophy. Wow. I have myself, I don't know if you're thinking of the same kinds of studies I've heard of, like chimpanzees that are said to have displayed empathy towards other chimpanzees. And then sort of the idea, I think what Alexandra is saying is that if we're closely related to chimpanzees and you find empathy in chimpanzees, right, fellow feeling, taking care of others, if that comes naturally for chimpanzees, then probably all the more so for ourselves, which seems to support Rousseau's idea that, you know, we probably are. Okay, and then I've got Jonathan says, during the time of war, the Great Depression, and our current event going on right now. Okay. The time as well, if we're in conflict. We have a mixture of both. I think I see what he's saying. Okay, yeah, and I would actually say now you're thinking, you're kind of putting on a sociology hat, more of a scientific hat, where you're looking at different kinds of factors or conditions, and then asking the question whether one variable changes alongside other variables, right? Like whether our empathic kindliness towards others, whether that increases or decreases under certain kinds of conditions, maybe under conditions of scarcity or conditions of perceived threat. Suddenly, where yesterday we may have been nice, suddenly we're no longer nice. We're all defensiveness, and we're all protectiveness, and we're all about hoarding, and worried about, I can only be nice as long as I'm alive. So I need to preserve myself. And then if I have anything left over, then I can start being nice, right? Maybe you're thinking in that way. Okay. Yeah, really nice contributions, guys. It's kind of nice having this chat thing where people can formulate their thoughts to themselves. Yeah, survival type of mentality, our natural instinct. Now, I just want to, on that last point, and then I'm going to go on to Durkheim and try to very quickly show where Durkheim weighed in on this stuff. Okay, the stuff I'm talking about now is not in your textbook, but it formed a foundation for Durkheim. He kind of like used them as a launching pad to come up with his own theory. I want to, as a social scientist, as a sociologist, we have this kind of conflicted or troubled relationship with claims about human nature and natural instincts. We're suspicious of them. Okay? Because it's easy to make a claim on the basis of your observations that, well, since I've seen people act like this under these situations, that's just human nature, which often means that is people's default mode everywhere on the planet, everywhere on Earth, right? So that might lead you to say humans are naturally aggressive. And if they're naturally aggressive, Okay, if left to their own devices, then in order to curb that aggression, you need to institute X kinds of laws, right? So your assumption about human nature, the way people are, can lead by a kind of logical progression to certain kinds of policy and legislative recommendations. But what if it turns out those assumptions about human nature are wrong? What if actually the behavior you're using to deduce what you think is human nature are actually the products of certain kinds of historical conditions? Okay? Then, essentially that's what Hobbes was doing. Hobbes was observing a society that was racked by civil strife, civil wars, and basically taking his observations and saying, and that leads me to my conclusion that humans are nasty, deep down, self-preservation machines, right? Maybe if he was sampling a different society at a different time, he would have come up with other conclusions about what eternal human nature is like. And I think that's actually a profoundly sociological view of things. It kind of, I guess, de-rigidifies our views about human beings. Okay, that said, let me march on to Emil Durkheim. And the first thing I want to say is the following. Let me share again. Share my screen, share my PowerPoint. Is Durkheim was very suspicious of this, of their views. Is the first thing he said is that they're pre-scientific. They're not scientific. And in fact, they were actually doing their writing about long before the idea of the scientific method got adopted within sociology. Durkheim says, that whole contract theory thing, if you think about it, now you may agree with this or you may not, but I want you to remember what his criticism is. He said, so you're saying once upon a time, the reason laws and government and the social order, excuse me 1 second. I really appreciate it. Sorry about that. All right, sorry about that, guys. So here's what he said. He said that if you think about it, every single person in a state of nature would have to be identical to each other. They would have to be suffering in precisely the same way. If they weren't, not everyone would agree to those terms. If you were making out fine, if you were coming out ahead in this old state of nature, if somebody said, well, let's come up with a set of laws that limits our ability to do this, that, and the other thing to other people, they'd say, well, no, because it's working out good, right? Somebody who's suffering in that position might say, oh, yeah, I'm all for it, right? So Durkheim, he figured, no, unless we could imagine a situation in which everybody was experiencing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, that agreement wouldn't happen, okay? So he thought this was more of like a fairy tale than anything else, that you couldn't actually find it. There would probably never be any real hard evidence for something like this, okay? I don't know if he's right or wrong, but that was his view. Okay, now, what did Durkheim see as the glue that held society together? And actually, let me do this. Let me just go through and give you, I'm going to change up here, stop share, and then I'm going to try to use a tool that I've been practicing on earlier and see if this works. Okay, I'm actually going to skip a whole series of steps that I usually use that are kind of implied in the way the PowerPoint is organized. And instead, I'm going to try to use this guy right here, what's called a whiteboard on this Zoom tool that I have. I'm waiting for it. Okay, and so you should see the following. I want to move this guy right here. No, it's not going to let me move it. So here's what Durkheim said. Durkheim said that the way in which the glue that holds society together is what he called, okay, so the glue that holds society together is not necessarily a set of explicit laws that come about through an agreement between everyone, at the same time. Okay, the glue that holds society together for him was what he called collective consciousness. Okay. So as you can see, it's some kind of mental phenomenon, right? Consciousness. And let me just remark that this should appear to you as kind of a curious idea, right? We all know what consciousness is, or we know the kind of thing that you can say about consciousness, right? Consciousness is, I don't know, your experience of the world. It's the thoughts in your head. It's your perceptions and smells and this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things about consciousness is we usually think of consciousness as the kind of thing that is inside individual people's, individual human beings, individual organisms' heads. What does it mean, you might ask, to say that consciousness is collective? And by the way, there's been lots of criticism and questions and doubts and ridicule and so on heaped on Durkheim because of this concept of collective consciousness. But he did say it is the glue that holds society together. Okay, for our purposes, we can simply define the collective consciousness as being, I'll say, non-material culture. Okay, so things like beliefs, sentiments, ideas, language, representations, so on and so forth, ways of feeling, ways of thinking, and the like, symbols and so forth. And then what he said is the following. He said that depending on the kind of society, you might have a different flavor, a different kind of collective consciousness. DOL means division of labor. When division of labor is small, what division of labor means basically is occupational specialization. So specialization, take a society like a hunter-gatherer society, where you have just a few dozen people who live together, and this is like in pre-industrial times. There's this group called the Kumsan that I think I may have mentioned in sub-Saharan Africa, way down towards the very south of Africa, Namibia, South Africa, and so on. And before they actually became converted to like city living and agricultural living, they just did hunting and gathering of like antelope type creatures and nuts and berries and so on and so forth. And what you had there is you had individuals who pretty much did the same thing that everyone else did. If you were male, you learned how to hunt, and you learned how to hunt exactly the same creatures with the same kinds of bows and arrows and spears, with the same kind of tracking methods. If you were female, you gathered the same exact kind of, nuts and berries and so on as all the other females, mothers and grandmothers did. You occupied exactly the same environment, okay? So you were familiar with the same landmarks and the same kinds of, rhythms of wet and dry seasons and so on and so forth. So your environment was the same. Your knowledge of the land was the same. Your beliefs, okay, in the supernatural and how to heal people, all the same, okay? So there was no division of labor. Everyone did the same kinds of stuff, okay? And under those conditions, we have so in a small scale society with very little division of labor, the collective consciousness is basically, which Durkheim calls mechanical collective consciousness. Why he called it that, we'll just leave aside for right now. What characterizes mechanical collective consciousness is similarity or commonality, okay? Similarity of experience. I wish I could write better with this, but I'm using my mouse to write, basically. It's not a pen. Beliefs. You believe the same thing. The Tib believed there was an ancestral substance, the disembodied spirit of ancestors who became angry or were upset or vengeful. They actually would inhabit a body, the stomach, the throat, or whatever, and make people sick. So that belief about the source of illness would be shared by all people within that group. So similarity of experience, beliefs, skills, and so on. Okay? Sharing all that stuff together was what allowed a group to coordinate itself, to act as a team, to do things in tandem. It's what held the group together. Then what he said, as division of labor increases and you begin to have societies which are much larger, okay, so large-scale societies, and internally these societies are characterized by different occupations, okay, and I'll make shapes that recognize different quadrants of, life, as it were. So you might have people who are agricultural. You might have people who are urban. You might have people who teach in the universities like Durkheim. You might have people who work in the factories. You have these widely diverging, widely varying kinds of occupations, and you may actually live in very different environmental conditions, right? From the hinterland, the countryside of France, much, much different than, the innards of Paris, for example. So in that kind of situation, we have great specialization, okay? So think about it this way. The Kung San, every single Kung San can do all the different kinds of jobs that you find there, okay? If you're a male, you can make and repair your bow and arrows. You can camp and decamp. You can heal. Okay, there's these healing rituals based on their belief. You can do it all. You wear many hats. In a large-scale society with lots of division of labor, lots of specialization, if you're a doctor, you don't grow food. If you grow food, you're probably not a doctor, right? If you repair shoes, you probably don't do, work in the IT, information technology sector, and vice versa, right? You only wear one or just a few hats, and if you want to, have other services rendered unto you or other kinds of products made for you, you have to go to other people. So that's great division of labor. In this kind of situation, Durkheim says the glue that holds society together, collective consciousness, has a different form. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I started to write solidarity. And he calls that organic collective consciousness. Organic collective consciousness. Now, if I look in your textbook, as I'm doing right now, I'm going to go with the definition he has, that your textbook has, but it turns out it's actually a little bit different in Durkheim. your textbook writes this. He says, Durkheim used the term mechanical solidarity to refer to social bonds based on common sentiments and shared moral values. Okay, that's right. That's what you find in Durkheim. Okay, it's pretty much what I had said. And then organic solidarity for bigger societies holds them together based on specialization and interdependence. And that's more or less what I just described, right? You are dependent on each other because you do very different kinds of work to supply the stuff you don't have. Okay? Characteristic of industrial societies. Okay? Solidarity, once rooted in likeness, is now based on difference. Okay? That's all correct. Okay? However, for Durkheim, when he wrote about collective consciousness, he actually said organic collective consciousness is based on ideas of complementary difference. So you carry an idea or image, of complementary differences okay. And what are complementary differences? They're differences which, when they're put together, okay, differ. Let me write the whole thing. Differences that complete one another. So they're different parts or different persons or different groups that by themselves are incomplete and not quite functional. But when you put them together, they fit. They fit in such a way that they now form a whole that works, that's functional. Here's an example. The example he gives is in the feudal system where you had peasants who worked the land and lords who owned the land. Okay, this is already a much more complex society than hunter-gatherer societies, in that they did very different kinds of things. I mean, what is the things that the lords did? They hobnobbed and negotiated and fought with other important people. They were literate for the most part. They were owners, not workers. Peasants were workers, right? That's all they did. They worked the soil, okay? They wore very different kinds of clothing in general, right? For the reason that they were impoverished relative to the lords. However, what Durkheim said is they carried around in their collective consciousness ideas about each other that made them believe that without each other they were incomplete. The Lord saw himself as a father-like protector of the peasants, and the peasants regarded the Lord as their father-like protector, and ideally would feel a sort of loyalty to the Lord for that reason. And if it was up to them to work the Lord's soil and actually send surplus product of what they made to the Lord, they didn't chafe. They weren't upset with that for the reason that they had this complementary image of this other person in their heads. So Durkheim's basically suggesting that the collective consciousness supplies us with ideas about counterparts, about different actors in our own society that glues us all together. Okay. Now, let me stop there. Let me just quickly summarize. Okay, small scale societies, mechanical collective consciousness. based on similarity. Large-scale societies with lots of specialization, division of labor, you have a collective consciousness that he calls organic, and organic collective consciousness is based on images or ideas of differences that are complementary. And that complementarity holds society together. It's the glue that binds, the ties that bind. Okay, now there's a little bit more to this, so I think I'm going to save that if I can, in case people want to find it for later. Then I'm going to erase it and I'm going to add one more thing. Okay, we'll have about, I would say, half an hour more to complete this, and then we'll be finished with the stuff I wanted to say about Durkheim. By the way, I'm not sure what you think about these ideas, if you find them compelling, convincing, not convincing at all. I myself have reservations about the ideas, as many people do. But let me go ahead and erase some of this stuff. Okay, and because I want to add, what do I want to add? I want to add what, okay, this isn't in your textbook, but it is in the PowerPoint. But like I say, I'm kind of shaving off a lot of stuff. Okay. And let's see, then I have to do this, and I think that. So, small scale societies. Small, okay, large. This would be like our society, okay? Durkheim would have large, that'd be like the US nation state. You have mechanical collective consciousness, not sure why the M didn't appear, and then you have organic collective consciousness. And then I also want you to know this, that Durkheim said, if you look back in history and you look for evidence of the collective consciousness, the evidence that you look for, he said, how can you actually figure out consciousness? You can't do it directly. You can't jump inside people's heads and like take a look at, open up their brains and say, oh yeah, there's a collective consciousness. I see what's in there. Oh yeah, similarity rather than, no, but he said you could look at laws. So you could look at, religious prohibitions or recommendations or what have you, sacred scripts from different, so he looked at sacred scripts from around the world, from Egyptian society, ancient Hebrew society, ancient Indian society, and so on and so forth. And he said by looking at their laws, their sets of documented do's and don'ts, okay, that gave you a glimpse into their collective consciousness. And so what you're doing is you're looking at their ideas about what's right or wrong, what's criminal or legal. So you're kind of looking at their legal systems. And here's what he said. He said, you find a correlation or pattern where you have small societies held together by mechanical collective consciousness, that is similarity. You find that there predominates a special kind of law, what he called repressive law. By the way, it's going to turn out that he's not right about this, but we want to know his theory. Repressive laws are like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Somebody violates some law. By the way, so I mentioned this group called the TIV last time in Nigeria, right? And I don't think I got into this much, but I did say that the TIV believed in witches, okay? People who commit harm by wishing it on other people. And they may have like secret formulas, hexes, and so on and so forth. So Durkheim would probably look at the TIV and say, since they're pre-industrial, they're probably held together by mechanical solidarity. And what that means is when somebody violates one of their key tenets of life, that is, you're not supposed to practice witchcraft because that hurts other people, every single TIV person believing the same thing reacts in exactly the same thing, with in severe outrage, intense outrage, and wants to, because they believe that witches hurt people, they want to hurt them back. So it's basically eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Eye for an eye. I'm not going to write the whole thing out, but you've heard that phrase before, right? Which basically means vengeance, right? It means getting even. Harm done should be answered with an equal amount of harm done, okay? And he calls that repressive law. And he says you find that here. Among large-scale groups with organic forms of solidarity, he says you find what he calls retributive laws. And the word comes from retribution. Retribution means you give something back. Okay? So you could call this the give back law. It basically means that you've been accused of taking something or deducting something from society that wasn't rightly yours. And so what you have to is you have to find a way to give it back. You have to give something back to the community if you took something away from it. We call that the give back law. And those tend to be less severe. So witches very often are exiled or they're executed, right? They're gotten rid of. A retributive law could very often be something like a fine, okay? An example would be a traffic violation. You parked where you shouldn't have, or you parked in a handicapped area when you weren't entitled to do so, and you get caught, you get fined, and you have to pay the fine. Okay? So they tend to be softer and gentler, and Durkheim said is that we move in scale from smaller to larger. Retributive laws come to take up more and more of kind of the legal space within society. It's not that you get rid of repressive laws altogether, but retributive laws become more predominant, more frequent, okay? Become more of a tool of social control. So that, guys, is Durkheim's famous, rather famous account of what holds societies together, okay? Now I'm gonna save that as well. And then there's one last element that I want to talk about today. And this is where he talked about when things go wrong, kind of when society is kind of unhealthy or pathological, if you will. Sure, I should be able to show that what it wants me to do. But I'm just going to move that if I can. And this is his concept of anomie. And let's see, I think I asked you to define that. And your book said, what Durkheim acknowledges the advantage of modern day freedom, but he warned of increased anomie, a condition in which society provides little moral guidance to individuals. Way of making this very, very quick, leaving aside a lot of little fine points, but getting the basic idea across, I believe. Durkheim wrote a book that he had this really happy title. The book was called Suicide. Very long book, one of the most famous books in all of sociology, rightly so. It's a brilliant book, brilliant analysis in which he tried to bring his the ideas together. So, anomie. Anomie, here's what anomie meant. Now, he actually had believed that there were several kinds of suicide. And I don't know if I'll explain these or not, but I'm going to put them up there in case I do find time to. He said there was what he called egoistic suicide. There was another kind of suicide that he called altruistic suicide. And then there was this, there were actually four, but I think I'm just going to, for right now, talk about anomie. And he noticed this. He noticed that in times of economic turmoil, and not just hard economic hard times when people were losing jobs, when wealth was being destroyed, when there was, a depression or recession or what have you, but even when the economy was roaring and jobs were being created and fortunes were being made, stock prices were rocketing, and so on and so forth. In either case, rapid economic growth or the recession, if you will, the frequency of suicide increased. He also noticed that if you chop up the economic sectors into the very wealthy sectors and the very poor sectors, so basically the rich sectors and the poorest sectors. This, by the way, was the agricultural sector. It was the sector of peasants, okay? The richest sectors were like owners of corporations, railroads, and mines, coal mines, and so on and so forth. Also the nobility of that era. The highest rates of suicide were among the wealthy. The lowest rates of suicide were among the poor. That struck him as requiring some kind of novel explanation. How can we account for that? And anomie is part of his explanation, okay? But it is based on an account of human nature that's not unlike Hobbes and Rousseau's, okay? He begins with the following set of ideas. I'm going to erase this one more time. I'm going to erase this up here. Okay, and I want to see what you guys think about this. So I'll ask your opinion in just a little bit. But he distinguishes between non-human animals, the non-human domain, your dogs, your cats, your turtles, your bacteria, all non-human animals, and the human realm. And here's what he says. This story about anomie is a story about desire and the regulation of desire, how desires are regulated or not. So here's what he says. He says in the non-human domain, so imagine, I don't know, I'm going to create a creature here. It's got 4 legs, okay? And it's got a mouth, and it's got really long ears, and it has a tail. It's got an eye, like that, okay? And it lives in an environment, and the environment has things like drinkable water, a little pool there. It has other food items, like other smaller animals with eyes and tails and so on. That's an animal, guys. It has shelter, so maybe trees. This dog-looking creature lives in a tree, right? It's got stuff in its environment, and here's the thing. The animal has within it a set of biological impulses or requirements, okay? An impulse to feed, an impulse to seek prey, an impulse to drink when it's thirsty, an impulse to shelter when it wants to sleep, right? It has all these internal needs, and Durkheim suggests that if the environment is such that it is able to supply those needs, the animal eats, the animal finds shelter, the animal drinks, and what have you, then there's established a natural balance. I think the way they translated Durkheim was they often use the word equilibrium, just right, it's a fancier word for balance. If there's a balance, a natural equilibrium between what the animal desires because of its biology and what the environment can produce, if there's kind of an equal sign between the two, then what you have is you have, let's call that a dog. You got a happy dog, right? You have a contented animal. Its needs are supplied, and it doesn't need anything else. It couldn't be happier, right? Okay? So imagine your dog or your cat or whatever animal you're living with. It may get restless. It might start sending you signs when it gets to be that time where it wants to eat, and it kind of like, says, hey, it's feed me time. You feed it, and then you look at it and you go, your worries are over, right? You are now the happiest creature on earth. Okay, so Durkheim suggests that happiness, oh, what did I just happen? Okay, that happiness comes easy in the non-human world. Then you have human beings. Stick figure, very thin, but it has this big egg-shaped head because it's got this hemisphered contraption that we all know as a brain, right? So here's the problem, says Durkheim, with human beings. Human beings may be animals, but they're a peculiar kind of animal. They're an animal whose environment is never sufficiently supplied with stuff so that we can draw an equal sign between what human beings want/need and what their environment provides them. So you might imagine, well, shelter, there's a house, and it's, it needs to rest sometimes. So there's a bed, right? And here's the refrigerator. We'll call that a refrigerator inside where it can get some food. So it gets all that stuff. But the problem is with this brain, because this brain or intellectual faculties in general are such that this brain can give itself images. It can use its imagination to think about an even bigger house with a nicer bed and maybe a car, right? It can imagine things that don't actually exist right now in its environment, right? It lives in a certain house, it has a certain bed, it has these things, and they supply its needs, or so it seems from the outside, except because of this brain, it is able to do what your dog does not, and that is imagine how life might otherwise be, differently from how it is right now. And then imagine that, okay, so it imagines this better house, bigger house with a car and so on. Maybe it achieves that. But Durkheim says, oh, because of the way this brain is built, there is nothing to stop it from imagining an even bigger house. And you see where this is going, right? It can go on to infinity. In other words, Durkheim is saying that there is no internal limitation or constraint on this faculty that human beings have for imagining hypothetical scenarios. The problem with these hypothetical scenarios is if you imagine a better, bigger set of conditions, that means you judge your present conditions negatively. That means you are dissatisfied. That means you are discontented. Discontentment, says Durkheim, is an inevitable outcome of how we are wired, to use a kind of way of speaking that he wouldn't have used, right? He says because of our intellectual faculties, because of the way that our brains work, we are fated, we are destined to being discontent. Your dog seems fated to being content. We seem to be born, okay, predestined for unhappiness. because of this faculty that we have. Now, here's then what Durkheim says, the next step that he makes is the following one, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start erasing this, and this will be the final step in his argument. Let me erase just the top part here to show you. Actually, before I do that, let me stop and let me ask if anybody takes issue with this. Are you on board with Durkheim? Do you think he's right about this? Do you think that you as a human being were sort of predestined for discontentment, unhappiness, dissatisfaction, because you have the kind of brain that's in the business of imagining better conditions? Right? So you have a bicycle as a little kid. There is nothing to stop your brain, says Durkheim, from imagining two bicycles, or a bicycle of a different color, or a bicycle with different handlebars, or, you know, some other bike that you don't have right now, and then saying, since you don't have that bike, the bike you have isn't good enough, so you're not happy, right? You can fill in the blank with any kind of example, but he's basically saying that our brains are made in such a way that we're bound to think in that way. Do you agree with him? Just wanted to throw that out to you guys. So this is kind of like my second big question. If anybody wants to pipe in verbally, they can do so. Otherwise, I'll see if I have anything coming here. If not, I'll go on and sort of finish my story. But that's his big question. Actually, as I'm not hearing anybody right now, I think we can go, in my experience tells me I usually get two kinds of responses. One that says that, yeah, man, that's me to a T. I mean, I'm doing that all the time. I could be happy if I weren't always thinking about how I could have this, that, and the other thing if life were different. There's other people who say, you know what, I myself, or maybe I know other people who seem to come to terms with whatever it is they have, and they don't ask, you know, for more. And so they're contented with what they have. So what we can ask is we can ask to what extent what Durkheim's describing is some kind of universal human nature, or whether or not our brains are sort of calibrated, or the settings of our brain are set by culture. And it actually depends on what our cultural rearing happens to be, whether or not we'll get into the habit of doing this thing that Durkheim says we do. So let me go back, share the screen again, see if that whiteboard comes back up, and I'll finish the story about anomie, what he calls anomie. I think it should come back up. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so here's what Durkheim says. Durkheim says that this is our predicament, this is our problem. In other words, what he's saying is that left on its own, human desire produced by our brain, okay, is not regulated. Okay, it's left to imagine more and better and more and better and more and better. Desire unregulated. And so what he says, and this brings us back to the collective conscience or consciousness, right? And so I'll just abbreviate it. I'll spell out the whole thing, okay? But I won't spell out the whole part of consciousness. I'll go like that. Here is where the collective consciousness does or does not play a role. The job of the collective consciousness, says Durkheim, is to put a cap on desire. It's to provide us with ideas, standards of right or wrong or appropriateness that will put a lid on our desires so that we don't say, I don't have enough. We'll say, I have enough. So go back to the example of the Lord versus the peasant. So what if the peasant was playing this game? What if its desires weren't regulated? It would probably look at the Lord and go, oh my God, I mean, this is terrible. I can't believe I'm living like this when the Lord is living like that. Look at my little hovel that I'm living in and my little, tatters and shreds that I'm wearing for clothes, okay? He would be miserable if he were comparing his present situations to what he could imagine. But Durkheim says what the collective consciousness does is it provides the peasant a set of ideas about what's appropriate to him. It trains his mind not to ask for more than what he's likely to get. Okay? So it makes his appetites, I guess, modest. Okay? So it creates modest desires or modest appetites. And, I mean, since you put it this way, he doesn't ask very much out of life, so when life doesn't give him very much, he's not unhappy. The Lord, of course, has larger appetites, and that's okay because the Lord, being where the Lord is, he's probably going to have those appetites met because the peasants are working for him, right? They're actually like the source of his wealth, ultimately. Okay? But it's okay for him to have these larger appetites because, they're going to be supplied. There is, however, a limit. So the Lord seems to limit, at a certain point, he says, that's enough. Beyond what I'm making right now, I'm not going to ask for the peasants for any more because he has some sense of the rightness or wrongness of what he should ask for the peasants. In other words, he doesn't overexploit him, at least, under in certain situations, or so Durkheim was imagining. In any event, this anomie, so let's go back to anomie. Anomie, says Durkheim, is a situation. It literally means a lack of regulation or a lack of law. So lack of regulation or lack of law. And Durkheim says that anomie occurs when society is rapidly changing, especially when its economic system is rapidly undergoing transformation. And what he had in mind was industrialization. And during industrialization, that happened first in England and happened subsequently, but not much later, in France, jobs changed. The way people work changed. The things they produce changed. And this led to upheaval in the social system. Okay? Eventually, France would live in a society in which there no longer were peasants in the way they used to exist. There would still be lords, but it would change a lot as well. Okay? You would have a different set of positions in society, but, said Durkheim, the collective consciousness would not keep pace with those changes. It wouldn't evolve in step with these larger economic transformations. And what that meant is it wouldn't supply the right kinds of standards, morals, ideas, and so on that were capable of regulating desires sufficiently. For Durkheim, this explained why in periods of rapid economic growth or rapid economic, busts, in times of economic busts, okay, when wealth was being destroyed, jobs were being lost, average per capita income was declining, and so on, you had higher rates of suicide, because what you have are situations in which the social fabric is changing, but the collective consciousness isn't changing in step in order to regulate people's desires. They didn't know how to say no, or not to ask for more than what they were receiving. Okay, I know that I'm going to actually sort of slow down and stop at this point. I'm not going to introduce any further elements into Durkheim's theories. And so what I'll do is, for the quiz that I'm going to make available on Saturday and will be available through the following Tuesday, I won't ask any questions on anything past what we've covered up through this point. I probably will have a question on anomy. Okay, your book mentions it very briefly. I've mentioned it in more detail, but I'm going to stop there. And why don't I ask you guys if you have any questions on any of the stuff we've covered on Durkheim so far, on mechanical organic solidarity, on, oh, there will be a question on probably Hobbes and Rousseau. Okay, there will be questions on that. If I add a discussion question, it will probably be tomorrow, okay? And I'll put an announcement and send you an email alerting you to that, okay? And it'll probably give you a choice of topic to discuss. All right, guys. Well, I don't know. That felt like it was a lot to me. I don't know if that felt that way to you, but if you guys have any questions about what the assignments are, again, okay, it's Karl Marx, right? That's basically fill in the definitions from your textbook. The discussion thread on ethnocentrism, the quiz on Durkheim, that'll come up on Saturday, and I'm probably going to add a discussion thread tomorrow. Okay, so those things will be coming on board. If you guys don't have any other questions then at this point, I think I will go ahead and stop there. Okay. Sound good, guys? All right. Feel ready? All right. Well, I'll look forward to getting your feedback, getting your contributions. And like I say, if you got any questions about anything, please let me know. All right. Well, have a good weekend, guys. And we'll see you next week then. All right. All right. Talk to you later.